In 2009, Lindsey Baum left a friend's house to walk home and vanished. Over the years, a number of persons of interest were identified, and then in 2012, her name came up in connection with a serial killer. Is there any chance the cases are connected? I'm Charlie Worrell, and this is Crime Lines and Consequences. This week, unfortunately, Eric came down with laryngitis the day before the recording, but I decided to go ahead and move on without him for this month at least. And I have a guest with me, Josh Hallmark from the podcast True Crime Bullshit and Unsafe Spaces and The Pact. Anything else, Josh?
I mean, that's good for now.
Karen and Ellen letters.
Our Americana. I mean, there's always something happening over here.
The playlist.
Yeah.
So there are a couple podcasts that Josh is involved with. Well, thank you for coming and being on the show with me.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to do what we do every time we get together, and that's talk about Israel Keys. You're kind of that, one-trick pony sometimes. One day I'll invite you on a show and I'll ask you about something other than Israel Keys and you'll be completely blindsided.
Oh, yeah. Just as long as it's not Kelly Cochran, I fully invite it.
Oh, man. Kelly Cochran is who I want to talk about the most, though. So she's the subject of the show, The Pact. And I don't even want to talk about her. I'm going to use the word characters because that's the only way to describe it. There were characters in that case.
The thing about that case is, like, for as many terrible, dramatized true crime shows as there are, I am shocked they have not done a Kelly Cochran because it is chock full of characters and it is so sensationalist.
Could you imagine the lifetime treatment of the investigating officers and their relationships and issues?
I just picture like Jennifer Jason Leigh as Kelly Cochran, and I give her an Emmy just for the idea.
Yeah, she gets an honorary Emmy in your brain.
Yes.
So for anyone who doesn't know, maybe we should just start at the beginning with who is Israel Keys.
Yeah, so Israel Keys was arrested in March of 2012 for kidnapping a barista named Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. And when they arrested him, they pretty quickly discovered not only had he murdered Samantha, but that he had likely murdered many other people. So throughout the course of 8.5 months, he was interrogated or proffered, I think 16 times. And throughout those discussions, he admitted to killing at least 10 other people. Eventually, he would name Bill and Lorraine Currier as two of his victims. And it was also quite clear that a woman named Deborah Feldman was a victim as well. He would give little clues and details about his crimes, but he never named any other victims apart from the Curriers. And then in December of 2012, he died by suicide in his cell. And many of his secrets and his list of victims went with him. So I have spent the last 10 years effectively trying to identify his remaining missing victims. And I think where the Lindsey Baum case comes into play here is when the FBI searched his computers, they, through photo matching on NamUs, were able to identify at least 45 missing people who Keys had looked at online. And so I have named them the NamUs 45, and what we've been doing is going through and trying to determine if any of those 45 could be Keys victims. And we'll get into how we go about doing that, I'm sure, at some point throughout our conversation. But what's important to note is that many of them absolutely were not Keys victims. So this is not some sensational list of his victims. Some of these people disappeared before he was even alive. Some of them disappeared when he was a child. So it's a lot more complicated than just him looking up his own victims online.
But we do know that 2 of his victims were on that list.
Yes, Bill and Lorraine Courier were on that list, and Deborah Feldman would have been had he spelled her name correctly while he was searching for her online.
Right. So we know that there is a possibility that even though we know some of them are not, and some of them also, may have been like within a time period where it could have been him, but there's, either stronger suspects in the case, or even in some cases, like the Kara Kopetsky case, there's a conviction.
Yeah.
So we know it's not him.
But there are also some that we feel very strongly were his victims, and we're just shy of
Mhm.
physical evidence at this point, but there's significant circumstantial evidence.
So in this case, as Lindsey Baum, to get into some of her background, she was 10 years old and she lived in a small town in Western Washington called McCleary. And the nearest city would be about Olympia, which is about a half an hour drive east. She lived there with her mother, Melissa, and her older brother, Josh, after their parents had divorced. So Washington is kind of a hot spot for keys, isn't it?
Yeah, he lived in Washington most of his life, I think from the age of 3 until 2007, which would make him, I always have to do weird math with this, would make him 28. He, briefly left the area. He lived in Oregon for a year and a half. He lived in New York for about 6 months. And then he served in the army in Texas and the Middle East for about a year and some change. But until 2007, he was mostly in Washington state, specifically in the Olympia, Tacoma area where he was stationed for a year and a half with the Army, and then later on in Nia Bay, which is on the northwest end of the Olympic Peninsula. So on the peninsula, just as McCleary is, but on the other end of it.
And so Lindsey was not from Washington. Her family had just recently moved there. They had family in the area, but she had been mostly raised in Tennessee. One of the reasons her mother, Melissa, picked McCleary was because it was a small town. There were about 1,700 people. So she was imagining it as a great place to raise kids, that slow pace feel to it where everyone knows everyone and it really feels safe. And we will see that neighbors really did look out for each other like kids as they were running between friends' houses. So this case takes place on Friday, June 26th, 2009, when Lindsey, like I said, was 10 and her brother was 12. They had been swimming at a friend's house and they went home with their friend Michaela. Lindsey and Michaela wanted to have a sleepover, but Melissa said it's up to Michaela's mom, so then they went to walk over to Michaela's house to ask. It was about a mile or so between the houses, so we're talking like a 10-minute walk for little kids. Not that little of kids, but Melissa's car had been broken down at this point, so she couldn't drive them. On the walk over there, Lindsey and her brother Josh got into just a pretty generic sibling spat, something about a bicycle. But one of these neighbors, the ones kind of keeping an eye on everything going on in the neighborhood, overheard them and suggested that the two just separate. So she sent Josh home and Michaela and Lindsey continued on to Michaela's house. When they got there, Michaela's mom was not keen on them having a sleepover that night, so she said no. And around 9:15, Lindsey left to walk home. Because that neighbor had turned Josh around, Lindsey was walking by herself. It was summertime, so it wouldn't have been pitch blackout just yet.
I will reserve any comment or judgment because I'm not a parent and I don't understand the anthropology of that particular area. But I will say we looked into this and the sun set at 9:12. So when she left the house, it was getting dark. But also everything I've read is this, like you said, this is a small town where people look out for each other. It's pretty rural. It's a little bit isolated. And I think it just has that slow paced, everybody's safe. We are isolated from big city drama. So I could understand the inclination to have her walk home.
So I have a 10-year-old and I don't live in a rural area. I live in a very residential part of a city. But, I let him go. He rides his bike down to the school and rides around there. But one of the things I have is this thing called technology. He has this little smartwatch. It's like almost like a cell phone, and he can call me from it and he can text me from it, and it's completely secure and it has GPS, and he wears that. So I just have the kind of that added layer of safety. I always wonder what my parenting would have been like in a time before I could use technology to track my children and their whereabouts. Even with my older kids, when they start driving, I have an app on their phones, Life 360, not sponsored, but it tells me how fast their top speed. So I can monitor things a little bit, and I try not to be too helicoptery about it, but just keeping an eye on things, it's kind of helpful. And so I always kind of wonder what I would be like if my 10-year-old didn't have a smartwatch on his wrist.
That is like simultaneously terrifying and I guess like comforting.
It's a lot. I have a lot of feelings because I definitely feel that there is a lot of social emotional growth that happens being independent of your parents and not having your parents monitoring you and watching what you do, and making mistakes is so pivotal to becoming a fully functioning adult. So I try to not always parent the information I get from these little apps that tell me what my kids are doing, but if like they're out somewhere that they're not supposed to be, at least I know their little things moving, so at least their phone's moving around, and I know they're probably at least, somewhat safe, and I can open up a conversation about, "Hey, what'd you do last night?" And kinda things like that. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about my much older kids, not my 10-year-old. He has to tell me everything. It's a requirement.
I will say though, like supporting the neighbor's decision and Melissa's general description of McCleary, and maybe we're going to get to this, like Lindsey was being watched. One woman reported that she saw Lindsey about halfway on her walk home. Another person said that they saw her at some point. So like she was known in the area, and this was a neighborhood where people were paying attention to what was going on around them. So I can understand just based on that, a feeling of safety, a feeling like we're all in this together. This is a community. And while, yes, she's walking home alone, like there are people who are looking out for her.
I definitely got that impression too because of how many people saw her both going to Michaela's house and coming back, that they people knew her, she knew them, and so it definitely sounds like the community you would feel your kids are safe in, and statistically speaking, they probably are safe. We can't always just like look at this one instance and then be like, "Oh, clearly we need to lock our kids down more." This really is an exception, and I never want to come across as though, I believe in parenting through like fear mongering, because I absolutely don't. I recommend the book Protecting the Gift on my other podcast, Crime Lines, all the time. It's by Gavin DeBecker. If you have children and you want to know like actual practical ways to keep your kids safer without, smothering them through helicopter parenting, it's definitely a good book. But back to the case. So we have Lindsey is heading back home. We know she made it at least halfway there. Around 10 p.m., Melissa, her mom, was home and hadn't heard back from Lindsey one way or the other about the sleepover plans. So she called over to Michaela's house, and that's when she found out that Michaela's mom said no to the sleepover and that Lindsey had left probably 45 minutes before. So she certainly should have been home. Michaela did have a cell phone, but she had left it behind in her room charging. So Melissa knew that Lindsey was scared of the dark and didn't like going out to the car to get things at night, so it seemed strange that she wouldn't have come straight home if she was sent home at dusk. After looking around the neighborhood for a little bit, Melissa called the police at 10:45 to report her missing. Now, Josh, I know you look at a lot of cold cases. It's pretty much all you do all the time. And a lot of these cases go cold because the killer got lucky, but sometimes these cases happen where the police just didn't take it seriously. Have you seen that happen in the cases you've looked into?
Oh yeah, all the time. You know, There are a bunch of the Nameless 45 are teenage kids, and we've deep dived most of those cases, and I would say 75% of them, the police immediately or very quickly decided that these kids were runaways. And then in most of those cases, it became clear eventually throughout the investigation that they were not, but it required uh, insistence and advocacy from outside people, including family members, to get the cops to take these cases seriously before those investigations even turned up any leads. So it happens all the time.
And you have to wonder if that would have happened here if Lindsey wasn't 10, but she was more like, 13, 14, 15. Those are the ages where writing them off as a runaway happens a lot more often.
And even Lindsay's mom had said, there's no way she was a runaway because emotionally she wouldn't leave without her dog. And just logically speaking, she had no money, she had no means, and she had nowhere to go. It just wouldn't make sense for her at 10 years old to run away.
Right. And if a 10-year-old does run away, they're at a particular vulnerability that a 15-year-old, while still vulnerable, wouldn't be at. So there's always going to be a quicker response, or at least you would hope when you're talking about a 10-year-old. I have seen cases where there isn't a huge response right away, but in this case, there definitely was. Melissa told them that Lindsey was not the type to wander off, so they started a massive search. I mean, they're using heat sensors from a plane to see if they could find her. The FBI would come in on this case, and there were tons of ground searches. They had scent dogs that led the police to a property just outside of town. But what really interested me about this is that the dogs didn't go there once or twice, but repeatedly. However, they did not find any trace of Lindsey there. Because this case does involve a divorced couple, there is a non-custodial parent who had to be looked into, and Lindsey's father, Scott, was absolutely investigated, quickly ruled out because he was in Tennessee at the time, and they could prove that he hadn't recently traveled to Washington. He was in the National Guard. He was planning on deploying to Iraq in a few months, so he flew straight to Washington to kind of help search, and he was really hoping to get answers about where Lindsey was before he deployed. So as we were talking about, the neighbors were really looking out for Lindsey. And I think another benefit we had here was that it was a warm night, unusually warm, which is why they were at the pool. And so everyone had their windows open, which also tells us that when no one is reporting that they heard a scream or the sound of a car speeding off, you also have to take that into account. Now, Melissa did tell the police about two weird interactions that happened in the weeks before Lindsey disappeared. The first was that Lindsey and her friend reported being followed by a man in a white car. Now, there were plenty of sightings of white cars in the area around the time Lindsey went missing, but if you look out your window right now, you are probably going to have a sighting of a white car. It's very vague.
Despite the vagueness of that description, police did look into it, and they pulled surveillance footage from a local gas station that would have been on Lindsey's route. And they did find what they call a similar white car that had been pulled over on the side of the road by the woman who saw Lindsey on her walk home. But they went on to say, there's no indication that the vehicle was involved in her disappearance or that it was the same vehicle. But I think it, A, is worth noting, but also B, it's great when you see the police really going to extremes to investigate, because it would be very easy to write this off and just not look into it any further. But they did take the time to get the video and to look for a white car, which I'm sure there were many. So yeah, just a small aside.
And I think the white car does come up when they are looking into persons of interest, because when Lindsey and her friend are saying they were followed by a man in a white car, that is certainly an alarm bell. The second incident was that Lindsey and a friend were in the bathroom at a park and a man walked in. He left, which would make you think, oh, he accidentally went in the wrong bathroom and there were two young girls, so he turned around and left. But they said it's more like he fled and he took off on a bicycle, which made it sound like he had a guilty conscience and was trying to get away. And this bicycle is significant because there was another abduction in McCleary 6 years before Lindsey went missing, and it did involve a man on a bicycle. This man approached a 17-year-old while she was in her garage and forced her back into her own car and made her drive to a second location where he raped her. He then forced her to a third location where he left her zip-tied in her car, and he got onto a bicycle and rode away. She did manage to drive herself home, and her father called the police. They did a rape kit where they were able to get male DNA. So let's go ahead and put a pin on this on our timeline because we are going to come back to it later.
And what's interesting about this is when we came across it, knowing that Lindsey was on Keyes' computer, and we'll get into some of the details of her disappearance that match things that Keyes has said, but this sounds like Keyes. This is very much his MO, where he approaches someone in an isolated or secured place, uses their car to get them away from that place. He's using zip ties and then escapes on a bicycle. These are all markers of Keyes' abductions, things he admitted to doing throughout the courses of his criminal career.
And Keyes confessed to committing rapes that did not end in murder, correct?
Ish. He was always very cagey about it, but that's the general thought. He did say that, he would never use the word rape, I think, is where it's hard to kind of get hung up on what exactly he's trying to say. But yeah, that's generally what he was alluding to.
That's a really interesting thing to note, that he does not say that word.
Very rarely. I think he says it twice throughout the 36 hours of interview that I've listened to. He usually says take instead of rape.
Over the years in this case, there were about 40 people identified as persons of interest. Now, that does not mean suspects, but it means people who might know something that would lead to solving this case. Now, as for those that got at least a little closer to the suspect list, there was one man who worked at a retirement home, and this home was along the path that Lindsey would have walked. One of his coworkers actually called him in as a tip because he did drive a white car, and the coworker noticed that his white car wasn't around much the week after Lindsey's disappearance. And obviously in the media and in police statements, they were saying things about a white car.
The coworker also noted that his white Honda Del Sol had a very loud exhaust, and that generally you could hear him driving before you even saw the car. And I know that in one of the cases, I believe it was the neighbor who saw this white car parked in front of her house. She had mentioned that it had a very loud exhaust when it left the area.
He did give an alibi, and it did not hold up to scrutiny. And he also sent a very odd text to a friend about Lindsey's disappearance, claiming that she had probably been chopped up and hidden in crab pots. And that is one of the most morbid, grimmest, grossest things I can imagine anyone just saying about a missing child.
Yeah.
He did have an accusation of sexual assault on his record, though charges were never pressed, so he was not convicted in that case. And then we have another person whose business was also on that path that Lindsey would have been walking. This was a jewelry store owner, and he also gave an alibi that put him 40 minutes away that night. But then it turned out that he was wrong on where he was that night. He was in McCleary. And of course, if you give an alibi to the police and it doesn't check out, it's definitely going to get you on police radar. He said he didn't lie. He was just somewhat confused about which night it was.
Which is fair. I mean, not to give him too much grace, but if you asked me where I was 3 weeks ago, I would probably get it wrong, or I would need to look at my calendar, or it would take me 40 minutes to figure it out.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm someone who has I have pretty specific habits and things I do, but I would mix up nights too, even though I'm pretty scheduled in everything I do. I could see mixing it up, or, they say Wednesday night, but I'm thinking about Tuesday night. I can see it happening.
Apparently, the Honda Del Sol man, the white car man, had been cited by police for following Melissa Baum in his car. When asked about it, he said that it was a misunderstanding and he had no idea who was in the car that he was following. He said that he saw the vehicle driving suspiciously around the parking lot of his job and suspected that they were there to steal parts from his car. And so he was surveilling them.
That's an interesting explanation.
Yeah.
They're acting suspicious, so I'm going to suspiciously follow them.
Yeah.
With the man from the jewelry store, they did search his home, business, and car. They did find some handwritten notes about Lindsey's disappearance, but I didn't find anything that really tells us specifically what it was, just that nothing he wrote or whoever wrote implicated him in the crime. I mean, the case was massive news in the town, as you can imagine, and he did know Lindsey, at least in passing, as she made her way back and forth between friends' houses. So, I mean, he did have reason to have her disappearance on his mind other than being guilty.
For sure. And I think that's the thing is like out of context or without further discussion, a lot of things can seem like red flags, but I'm sure you and I have handwritten notes about local cases all over our offices.
I do have a list of potential serial killer victims right in front of me right now, and it is a local case, and I promise I had nothing to do with it. Over the years, there were a lot of rumors in town, including ones that I have actually seen these come up pretty frequently in missing persons cases, particularly missing children's cases. And it's that someone hit her with a car and panicked and hid the body. I think if, she was hit by a car, there may have been more of a commotion, particularly with all these people seeing all these other things that night. It seems odd no one would have heard any type of impact or squealing tires or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there were other rumors that involved the family, which those always come up all the time. The theory was that Lindsey did make it home that night. And one of them actually kind of makes me think of the JonBenet Ramsey case. It's the accusation that because the siblings had argued earlier that night, that her brother had done something and Melissa helped cover it up. And there's absolutely no evidence of this, and there's actually evidence it didn't happen. Melissa didn't even have a working vehicle that night. She was witnessed looking for her daughter, and the police brought dogs in to search that night. So where and when did she hide Lindsey's body so well that they never found her, or they didn't find her that night? Like, there's evidence that she didn't have any involvement, yet rumors and gossip don't tend to care about facts very much.
Well, even just the window of opportunity is only 45 minutes. So even if somehow she had made up that her car was not working, and somehow, Josh was complicit with whatever the lie was, like, that is not enough time
Right.
for someone to commit and conceal this crime. Because again, it's like 45 minutes at the very most that this could have occurred in.
And even among people who don't think Melissa did anything to her daughter, she got judgment anyway for letting her children walk to their friend's house, when it was starting to get dark. Now, Melissa's only response to that was that people can't imagine the guilt she feels. And I think that's always important to remember. With these cases, our judgments on the family are nothing that they haven't already beaten themselves up over. But in this case, I think her beating herself up over it is entirely unfair because she had so little to do with the circumstances. She sent them together probably for safety. And because of circumstances outside of her control, her daughter was walking home alone. She had absolutely nothing to do with that.
I also, and on a personal level, it breaks my heart that I'm about to say in the good old days, but like when we were kids, when I was 10, I was running all over my small town. Every other kid in town was, and there was less security, less surveillance, less tracking back then. I just think maybe, fear and the media has made us a little too precious, because I don't think it's unreasonable in a small town to have your kid out, like walking around at 10 years old. Maybe I'm crazy. I also don't have children, so grain of salt, I guess.
I do have a lot of children, and I think you're correct. I mean, obviously, I have my children under surveillance because I spend my days immersed in this. And so it's hard to remind myself all the time that this is the exception and that for the most part, our kids are actually safer than when we were kids. And it's just very interesting to me when people are like, oh, you remember when we were running around all the time and things were so much safer. And I'm like, look at the most active serial killers in the US, and this is when they were active, is when we were running around the neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's not that we were safer, we just didn't have a 24 news cycle telling us we were unsafe.
Exactly.
So this case continued, just it grew cold, and then in 2012 Israel Keyes was arrested for the murder in Anchorage, Alaska, and he started getting looked into for other cases. And like Josh had mentioned, Lindsey Baum is one identified by the FBI as him having her picture on his computer or his girlfriend's computer or some device he had access to.
It was his girlfriend's desktop computer, because the few times that he did use a computer in his home, he was, I guess, smart enough not to use his own. He would use his girlfriend's, which, epically shitty.
Yeah. Of all the things he did, he also did not like to implicate himself, but he'll implicate someone else. He would sometimes, did he use like library computers to do more direct searches sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Keyes also made a comment about not killing children, or at least not doing it after his own daughter was born. Do you believe him?
Ish. I don't think this is, and I'm going to speak in Keyes terms, which are not exactly the same as normal people terms. I don't think this was an outright lie per se. I think it was maybe misdirection, because he did. What he said was, after his daughter was born in late 2001, he could no longer target young children. However, he made a comment about, in 2011, he said that he knew he was losing control because he didn't usually go after kids. So there are a few exceptions in that, which is like he didn't normally go after kids, but he knew he was losing control because the implication is he went after a kid. The other red flag there is the word usually. So I think, like, as a rule of thumb, he probably didn't target kids. However, I've talked to some forensic and criminal psychologists, and they all agree that if he was primed to kill and a target that he was going after did not work out, then he would just go for an easy victim. And in that case, that could be a child. Because once a serial killer is primed to kill, it's very hard for them to abate that need.
And also, I think sometimes people will use the word children to mean a very specific age range, and they don't just mean everyone under 18 or everyone under 13. So, unless he gave me pretty strict parameters on what he meant by children, I don't think a victim being a child is immediately a reason to rule him out.
And it's not like he's out there like carding people before he kills them.
Right. So, what criteria do you use to rule a case in or out?
It's less about general criteria and more about specific statements, and how they line up. So, why Lindsey's case became important to us? Obviously, she's on the name as 45, but there are a lot of circumstances in her case that line up with statements Keyes made about victims. Most specifically, and I think we'll get into it in a minute, is he said that there was one victim whom he abducted from Western Washington and murdered and buried in Eastern Washington. Second to that, McCleary is near where Keyes lived. It's an area he was very familiar with. It's also a working class small town. And the thing about Keyes is he liked to operate in areas that he could blend in. And we have found that that is almost exclusively working class small towns. The other thing that stands out is, by 2009, Keyes was living in Anchorage, Alaska. So it's easier to place him in areas or rule people out because of his travel. But he actually happened to be in Nia Bay, Washington in June of 2009 doing construction work there. So again, it does make Lindsey a possible, if not plausible, Keyes victim. He was likely in the area at the time. Again, it's a place he knew well. McCleary geographically is quite close to Nia Bay because of the mountains there. I think it's about a 3.5 hour drive. But, for Keyes, who for the couriers drove over 1,000 miles, like 3.5 hours is not a big deal at all, particularly because he likes to create distance between himself and his crimes. But I think if we're talking about the biggest red flag, we should talk about what happened in 2017.
Yeah, so Lindsey's case does remain unsolved, but she's no longer considered a missing person because in September of 2017, an elk hunter found a skull fragment about 185 miles away from McCleary in a remote, heavily wooded area. And in 2018, the fragment was DNA matched to Lindsey Baum, but no other remains were recovered in the area.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to the statement of abducting from Western and burying or leaving in Eastern Washington. Also, Keyes had specifically asked when they were talking about jurisdiction whether Ellensburg, Washington was considered Eastern or Western. And when they said Eastern, that's when he said, okay, yes, there was someone who I abducted from Western and buried in Eastern. And where Lindsey's skull was found is not far at all from Ellensburg, Washington. So that lines up very accurately with at least one of his victims. Of course, he did not give any other details about who that victim was or the circumstances surrounding their abduction and murder.
So I know with some areas you only have like short windows that Keyes was there, so it might be easier to narrow down your search when you're looking for possible victims. But Washington is somewhere where Keyes lived, as you said, a lot. And even when he wasn't living there, he would be there for a significant amount of time. So it's like you almost have too broad of a timeline. So how do you handle cases in a state like Washington versus somewhere like Indiana where he was only there for a short window?
I always say, because people will ask about particular cases, and in Washington, I almost always say, like, we can't place Keyes there, but that doesn't mean it wasn't Keyes, because he went there with great frequency. His daughter lived there for much of his time in Alaska, and even when she was living with him in Alaska, she was visiting her mother down there. He had friends and family down there. Also, it was a place he operated in and knew very well. He lived on both sides of the state. He worked at the Parks Department for the Macaw. He grew up in Colville, which is outside of Spokane. This was a state he knew better than any other place in the world. It's where he alluded to, and we believe he committed most of his murders. So it stands to reason that, like, he was likely there multiple times throughout every year after leaving. And he was well traveled within the state. He knew people all across the state. He had access to land or was familiar with land all across the state. So unless we can definitively place him anywhere else at any given time, Washington is always in play.
I do think it's interesting how many overlaps there are with Lindsey's case and the few details he gave, and knowing, when he was there. And also, if he's making a comment that he knows he was losing control because he didn't normally target children. This was 2009. He was just caught a few years later.
The one thing that's interesting to me, and where, I believe Keyes, which make of that what you will, is Lindsey's approximate age to his daughters. And that's the one thing I could see maybe preventing him from abducting Lindsey or someone her age. But also, like I said, he's not out there carding people. And if he's primed to kill, he's probably just going to target anyone who's easy, which could be a 10-year-old kid walking home alone at night.
So in cases where there is a person of interest who seems to be maybe even a stronger suspect than Keyes, does that play into you evaluating a case to see if Keyes did it, or do you try to push that out so that you can evaluate it without that extra information?
So what we generally do is, like, we compartmentalize that person and we do our work to, try to rule Keyes in or out, see what circumstantial evidence there is, see what similarities there are between, what we know about the crime or disappearance and what Keyes has said. And then when we're done with all of that and kind of have our thoughts on Keyes' viability as a suspect, then we decompartmentalize this other person, look at the evidence there, and make a decision on where the evidence is stronger. But until there is DNA evidence either incriminating someone else or ruling Keyes out, like Keyes is always going to be in the background for us. And I think of all the cases we've looked into, that is most relevant with Lindsey's, because there are other strong suspects in this case, but just the similarities in what we know about her disappearance and abduction and murder and what Keyes has said are so strong that it really is impossible to overlook at this time.
So, in a talking about a person of interest, there was one in this case that came out in 2021. And it started when the police decided to take a new look at that old rape case from McCleary that happened 6 years before Lindsey had gone missing. The statute of limitations was about to be up. So it was kind of one of those now or never situations. So they took out what is known as a John Doe arrest warrant, which is basically an arrest warrant for the DNA. Whoever matches that DNA is the person they got the warrant for. They did use investigative genetic genealogy and identified a man named Paul James Beaker, and he was arrested and charged. He did not deny that it was his DNA, but he claimed the sex was consensual, as was the use of restraints, but no one believed him. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Being that this was a small area for there to have been two abductions, even, 6 years apart, he was looked into in Lindsey's case. So some of the things that kind of, raise your eyebrow a little bit, certainly not evidence, but circumstances, is one, he had a son Lindsey's age who was in the same grade as her at the same school. And Lindsey was friends with the Beakers' neighbors. So he would have been somewhat familiar with Lindsey and maybe familiar enough to have pulled over and offered to give her a ride home. And he would have been just familiar enough to her as someone's dad that she would have gotten in the car. He was also a hunter, and the area where her skull fragment was found is a hunting area. That's why she was found by a hunter. And he may have had some familiarity and ties to that area. But the main thing that stuck out to me was that the property that the dogs took the police to on those searches, that was owned by Paul Beaker. He did take a polygraph and passed, for what that's worth to anybody. He does deny all involvement.
And this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say other suspects. For us, we did a treatment on this case almost exactly a year ago, and the research team and our general consensus was Beaker was a much stronger suspect than Keyes. But it goes back to, like, until we can definitively rule Beaker in, we have to keep Keyes in mind. And there are people who have done way more work on Lindsey's case than us, who have said that we should not rule out Keyes. They believe he's worth looking into further. But if I had to make a call, or if I had to prioritize the cases we're looking into, I believe Beaker is the stronger suspect in this case.
So I appreciate you coming and discussing this case within the context of Keyes. I know one of the hard things I imagine for you, because I think about it and I'm not even doing the investigative work, is that if you do identify a Keyes victim, potential Keyes victim, or even worse, like a likely Keyes victim, while the work is helping give people some answers and some information that they need, we do know from Keyes's very graphic confession in the Courier's murder that what he did to people was absolutely horrific. And so it's almost like a double-edged sword. Like, if you're getting an answer, but is that really the answer you want?
Yeah, one of the researchers, Shayna, always says she's so happy when we can rule Keyes out. And it is a double-edged sword, because it means that there's a family that's, further away from, not closure, but like understanding more, or there's a family that is still going to be searching for answers, but it means that whatever happened to that person, it wasn't what Keyes would have done to them.
Yeah, which is, I think, probably, I don't know if you've gotten feedback on the episode where you did get into the details of the courier's murder. It was one of the hardest things I've ever listened to.
Yeah, intentionally. So that is the one where people say they couldn't, that's where they stopped listening, or they had to skip it, or they were haunted by it. And it's the fourth episode of the show, and I had to make a decision to include as much as I did of that interview, because I really wanted to hammer home, this is not entertainment. This is real. And these are real stakes and real people who have gone through horrendous final moments of their lives. And for me, when I heard that, it messed me up for a very long time. And it really stuck with me, the reality of what we're doing and what we're consuming. And I just wanted everyone else to not have that experience, but have that very real, inescapable understanding. I ethically have a lot of concerns about how we consume true crime, and I guess that was my statement on how we should be thinking about the consumption of true crime media.
Yeah, in Lindsey's case, the FBI seems to be, somewhat in charge, I guess. They are the ones collecting tips. So if you do know anything about the murder of Lindsey Baum, you can call the FBI's Seattle field office at 206-622-0460, or you can always call your local FBI office. And now they allow you to submit tips online at tips.fbi.gov. We always encourage anyone who knows anything, even if you think it's too small, too insignificant. When we're talking about cold cases, you never know what you know, and it's important to reach out. So that information will be in the show notes. And I want to thank Josh for coming on and filling in for Eric with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to be your, I guess, B team gay.
I mean, I don't have you guys ranked that way in my mind or my phone or anything, but it works. Oh, there we go. Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the work you do on the Keyes case and how willing you are to share that information with people.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for you know, dipping your toe into the darkness that is my life.
It does get a little dark there, but it's fascinating, and I'm always impressed with the work you do. I know that you just recently had your kind of 5-year podcast anniversary with the show and released some special episodes. I hope people listened, even if they don't listen to the whole show. I think a lot of really important discussion came from those episodes you did on what is ethical true crime. How do we handle these cases? What's the toll on people listening? What's the toll on the people giving the information, and what's the toll on the families? I think you, throughout those episodes, really covered the whole range of those questions.
Yeah, and we actually, a very well received episode in that bunch was the episode I did with you and Shayna from the research team, where we talked about tips and how we evaluate them and what we do and where they lead us. So if you want more of Charlie or more of me, that's a great place to start, is the evaluating tips bonus episode.
Yeah. And you can find Josh's podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Again, it is, well, I guess if they search Studio Both and in their podcast app, probably all of your shows will come up, right?
I think so.
I think that's how it works, the author tag. Here's hoping.
So yeah, I just search Studio Both and Unsafe Spaces is my active podcast right now. If you like true crime bullshit, it is just as investigative, but I think there's more personal and historical flourishes to it. We're really getting to the core of how the crimes that I cover in that happened. And we talk about gay culture, we talk about histories of marginalization and homophobia and the politics of it all. It's actually some of the work I'm most proud of, and the show is looking for listeners, so go find it.
Yes, I'll definitely leave the names of all of Josh's shows that I can remember in the show notes so that everybody can find them. So thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.